I'm Maureen Paraventi, editor of Workplace Material Handling and Safety Magazine. I'm talking today to Tim Fisher. Tim is the Chief Safety, Health, and Well-Being Officer at the American Society of Safety Professionals, ASSP. ASSP is a global association for occupational safety and health professionals. For more than 100 years, ASSP has supported OSH professionals in their efforts to prevent workplace injuries, illnesses, and fatalities and advance their careers through education, advocacy, standards development, and a professional community. Thanks for talking with me today, Tim.
Thanks, Maureen. It's good to be here.
Good. Now, Tim, why are industry consensus standards important, and what is the role they play in occupational safety and health?
So what we want to do here with this little interview is we want you to learn something, and we want to we don't want this to be a boring presentation either. So a lot of people are like, oh man, standards, regulations, it's really boring, but it's not. It's not. So a couple things we're going to talk about today, I think are going to add some value to you out in the field. So when we talk about consensus standards, think about it this way: you have the government standards, and you have national standards, and you have state standards and local, all standards and rules and regulations, and then you also have the consensus standards, and those are basically what I would say standards, guidelines, rules, which I'm a little leery on using that term, but we're talking about a rule, whether it's voluntary or non-voluntary, it's still a rule, and it's written by the OSH professionals and the affected stakeholders. So they all come together, and what they really do is it's collective expertise, it's discussion, it's debate. And believe me, it can be a very virulent debate at times. It can be raucous meetings, and then out of this, what's going to happen it's a long process, and then out of the process will be a series of voting and ballots and all that. And what you're going to get then in the end is a standard or a guideline that you can use in the workplace to help prevent injuries, illnesses, fatalities, protect the environment. So think of it this way: it's not law, but it's definitely an operating practice, a procedure, guideline that you can use to make things better in your workplace. Back to you, Maureen.
How does a standard go from an idea to becoming an actual standard?
Well, that's a good question because at ASSP, and we have roughly about 125 full committees and subcommittees and all kinds of stuff. That's a very common question we get. Where do you guys come up with these ideas? And obviously, some ideas are better than others. I'll be the first to admit that. And that's absolutely true. So what happens is the vast majority of our ideas come from ASSP members, OSH professionals, and stakeholders. They bring them forward, they're looked at and evaluated, and then what'll happen is if ASSP thinks it's a good idea, it'll go in front of our Standards Development Committee, and they'll say, yeah, it's not a bad idea. But, and this is an important consideration, it's not just ASSP that does that. Also, the impacted committee has to come up and say, yeah, we think that's a good idea for a standard. So our A10 committee, for example, construction demolition operations, has 50 standards and projects. And so generally what happens is they will elevate the idea. It then comes to ASSP. ASSP says, yes, it's good. It's voted back down the line. After all is said and done, it's announced. And then what we do is we ask the general public, do you think this is a good idea or bad idea? And we do get comments on that. So one example is something we did on total worker health a number of years ago. We thought it was a good idea. The stakeholder community came to us and said, we don't think it's a good idea to write a guideline on total worker health. And so we backed off on that. So it's a two-way street. A long process, but it definitely results in consensus and hopefully some agreement moving forward. Back to you.
You touched on this a little bit, but who are the different individuals and organizations that are involved in standard development?
So when we talk today, here's a couple of important rules I think that people listening today need to understand, because we get this a lot. It's like, oh, these standards are written by ASSP members and they don't think about the stakeholder community outside of their own niche. And that's not correct. So for example, only half of all our standards participants belong to ASSP. Half to maybe even more than half do not belong to the society. So what are they made up of? They're made up of organizations, companies. And when I say organizations, labor unions, for example, labor unions are very significant on some of our committees. Other public resource organizations, government, of course, but a lot of companies, definitely some consulting organizations, a lot of professional associations get involved with us as well. So it's a whole consensus body when this is put together. An important consideration for people listening today is that a standards committee can only be made up of no more than 1/3 of a specific category. In other words, you can't stack the deck. And ASSP is absolutely ferocious, and I mean that term. We are ferocious on making sure that our standards are balanced with appropriate interest and consensus. Otherwise, they won't have credibility in the eyes of people listening today.
That's a very good point. Tim, let's dig a little deeper into the role that ASSP plays in the facilitation of these standards and their development.
So here's another. So we're going to get into some points today that I think are very, very important. One, if somebody comes to you, and this is something I've seen many times in my career, this is something you want to avoid. If somebody comes to you in your workplace and says ASSP wrote this standard or organization X wrote this standard, your antenna should immediately go up on that because ASSP did not write the standard. So neither does the American National Standards Institute. So if somebody comes to you and says ANSI wrote this standard or ASSP wrote this standard, you need to be leery of that. So basically what that means is the American National Standards Institute, what they did is they accredited organizations like ASSP to put together national level committees with all these different organizations, balance interests to write the standards. So what we do basically, it's a long-winded way of saying that we oversee and manage the process. And when, as I said the term, and I mean it, is we're ferocious on making sure that we follow those rules. And that's what we do. We manage the process, we manage the rules, we make sure that there's an even ground for everybody, and that no matter who it is, if it's one person, one company, one organization, that they have the ability to speak their mind. So that's what you think of. When you think about ASSP and standards, we manage, coordinate, and organize the effort. But we do not write the standard itself.
Now, Tim, what is the scope of the standards that ASSP publishes and the goal of the standards?
Now, an incredible point, Maureen, because this is another one that people listening here need to read. So there's a big argument out there. Does the scope drive the standard or does the standard drive the scope? So most ASSP standards are generally based around the top 10 causes of injury and fatality. And so that's generally what our scope is. But for people that are out there, so when you implement a standard, if it's the one thing I can say, or two things I'll say, one, know the year of the standard you're looking at. If you're looking at a 30-year-old standard, you better look a little bit further. Okay, so that's one thing. The scope is absolutely critical. I have seen organizations spend a lot of money and resources on trying to comply with a standard that doesn't include them by scope. So think of it this way. The scope of a standard, of a specific standard, says what the hazard or exposure is. And I'm going to argue there's a difference between a hazard and exposure. And so it's going to tell you that. And then the actual scope of the whole committee is generally it's very comprehensive. Our A10 committee is a good example. So that scope for that committee is to write standards that address construction and demolition operations. Then you have 50 standards and projects afterward that'll give you then specifics. So we have a standard on trenching and shoring. We have a standard on fall protection. So I know it's a long-winded way to say that, but overall, ASSP standards generally address the top 10 causes of injury and fatality, and then the individual committees go down a little bit further. They're still comprehensive, and then the scope of the individual standard then gets into the specifics of the hazard exposure we're looking to address. I know it sounds complex, but that's kind of the way it is.
I get it. Now, how do OSHA and other government agencies or organizations use standards?
So this is a big thing that we hear about a lot. So, and by that I mean I probably get 2 to 3 inquiries, and I'm not kidding, a week on this thing, which by ASSP standards is a lot. So this is Tim's experience speaking on this. So how does government use standards? Now remember one thing. OSHA is only one agency in the U.S. government. Okay, so we also have state agencies as well. And if we want to get really specific, you got federal OSHA, you got the state plans, with Cal OSHA and Oregon and WSHA. So is it complex? It is. And can it be confusing? It can be. So when we talk about how government uses standards, it's not just OSHA. That's the point I want to make. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, for example, uses a lot of our construction standards in their EM 385 manual. I would urge you to go look at that. That's available for free online. So that's a good example. So, but let's talk specifically about OSHA. So this is my experience. On how consensus standards are used. There's what they call an incorporation by reference. That's the one step which I've seen, and that is OSHA or a government agency has basically said, you will follow standard X or be able to show that what you do exceeds standard X. So our Z87, it's not ours, but I'm using Z87. It's actually an ISCA standard. I'm using our as a consensus standard example. So that deals with eye and face protection. That's an example of incorporation by reference by OSHA. And so what does OSHA say? You're going to use a Z87 eye and face protector, or you're going to be able to go out there and use a protector that you can show, prove, and have all the testing that shows that it meets. Most organizations then are just going to go with the Z87 protector, and that's an incorporation by reference. And essentially, the government says you will use this standard. You see a lot of that in corrosion control on pipeline systems. A lot of our standards, not just ours, I'm using consensus. The National Fire Protection Association is a really really good example of IBR. So the National Electric Code, the egress code, those type of things. Boiler and pressure vessels, elevators. Now I'm getting windy on this, but I need to make this point. So that's an incorporation by reference. The next example is what I would say is a 5A1, which is a general duty clause proceeding. And you'll see a lot of that, specifically when you're dealing with specific standards. Now, one thing somebody's going to say is that you can't write a general duty clause citation if a federal standard applies to it. Now, I understand that argument a little bit, but for example, our Z117 standard has been used in a number of 5A1 general duty clause proceedings, even though there is a federal confined spaces standard. So if you go on to OSHA and look at that, you're going to see those examples. So there you'll see that. And where have I seen that used? Our fall protection standards, lockout, tagout, confined spaces. You'll see some good examples. But another example, which I see a lot, is what I would call a settlement proceeding. So let's say, Maureen, you and I own a company, and unfortunately, we had a fatality. Somebody fell, and as a result of a series of negotiations with the federal government, or if it's a state plan or whatever it would be, we have to agree to also incorporate or implement a managed fall protection system. And what are you going to use? Well, you're probably going to use one of two standards. You're going to use either our Z359.2 standard, which is a managed fall protection standard, or if you're construction, you're going to use probably Z359.2 with a combination of our A10.32 standard. So those are three things where I've seen them. So as I noted, incorporation by reference, general duty, and then also the area that I see government using is in the settlement proceeding. I'm not going to get into the whole litigation aspect because I don't think that really addresses this particular question. But are our standards used in litigation? They are, but contrary to what most people on the call may think, they're actually used to protect an organization as opposed to trying to go after an organization. Back to you.
All right. Which OSHA regulations or consensus standards should safety professionals use to keep workers safe?
Well, this is a good one. So if you looked at ASSP's strategy with standards for many years, what we said is, okay, OSHA has its standards, but you need to look at our stuff. You need to look at our stuff. And that strategy didn't work too well. And the reason is because if you're talking OSHA standards, you got to follow them. It's the law. So you have to follow OSHA. That's your starting point. Now, what we've done as a result, and we have some very smart people on the ASSP team, they basically told me, Tim, your approach isn't the way we want to do this. What we want to do is show how our standards then will buttress the federal standards, work with the federal standards, support them. So fall protection is a good area. So you have, obviously, you have areas under OSHA that deal significantly with fall protection. Our Z359.2 standard managed fall protection fits into that. We think fills some of those voids. You'll see the same thing with trenching and shoring, for example, on that one, or lockout tagout. So when we talk about OSHA, you have to follow it. The other thing I'd say, and this isn't really this issue specifically, is know the difference between a federal state and a state plan state. So a state plan can't have different rules as opposed to what you're going to see at the federal level. And if we're talking consensus standards, sometimes they may recognize them depending on what that state's doing. So it's a long-winded explanation, but you have to follow the law. And then if there's any question, if you're dealing with compliance and that type of thing, then you look at the applicable consensus standard. So that would be my answer on that one.
I am glad you brought up the difference between federal OSHA and state OSHA plans. That's good to remember that. Last question for you. How would someone learn more about standards and get involved in the standards development process?
An outstanding question, Maureen, and I'm glad you asked it. So what are you going to do? You're going to, first of all, come to the ASSP website, and I'm not going to make an ad, but ASSP.org, just so we all know where you're going, and you're going to look at the standards area, and there's areas for you to go on. Or you're going to say, you know what, I want to get a hold of this Fisher guy. Maybe he might know something. So then I'm going to send him an email to tfisher@ASSP.org. No C in that, Fisher, TFISHER at ASSP.org, and we'll help you out. So of interest is, we keep hearing that maybe organizations and volunteerism maybe isn't what it used to be. I'll tell you what, in our standards area, that's not the case. We have over 1,300 individuals, companies, and organizations participating in our standards. We obviously would love to have the support. And so if you have any questions, definitely contact us, and we'll get you in the right direction. Back to you, Maureen.
Sounds like a dynamic and, may I say, ferocious process.
I use that term, but I mean, I would say that for people listening, if we're not above board, if we don't put out a good, credible product, if somebody thinks that we cooked the books or we didn't listen to everybody, the standard will have no value at all. So we are absolutely, and I use that term and I mean it, we are absolutely ferocious on following our rules and making sure that everybody gets a bite at the apple.
Well, thank you so much. I've been talking with Tim Fisher, Chief Safety, Health, and Well-Being Officer at the American Society of Safety Professionals, ASSP. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. I appreciate being on, and it was great to talk to everybody.
You can learn more about ASSP at ASSP.org. Tim, do you want to give your email address one more time?
Yeah, it's T Fisher, no C, TFISHER at ASSP.org. And generally, I respond within 24 hours. So you'll hear from me.
Thank you. And thank you for watching.
Thank you.